Hello and welcome to Shalom Uganda with author Janice Mazur. I'm Melanie Rubin, the Director of Senior Adult Programs at the Lawrence Family Jewish Community Center, Jacobs Family Campus, and I'm happy to be co-sponsoring this event with Lauren Lipke from our JLearn department. We're recording this event, so you're welcome to turn off your videos if you're more comfortable, but we encourage people to keep them on. And please do not take pictures of the photos presented without permission from Janice. We'll begin with her presentation and then we'll have Q&A after. So if questions come to mind, please type them in the chat and she will address them as time permits. Author Janice Mazur was born in Eritrea, grew up in a tiny, remote European Jewish community in Kampala, Uganda, under British imperial rule, with no rabbi or Jewish infrastructure. And then she attended university in New Zealand. Currently, she is living in Vancouver, Canada. In her book, Shalom Uganda, A Jewish Community on the Equator, Mazur tells her story of living in this little-known Ashkenazi Jewish community from 1949 to 1961. Without further ado, let's hear more about Janice's journey.
Good morning, everybody. Lovely to be here. There, I kind of wish that. Where did it go? I need to get in. Yeah. Just 1 second, please. I just need to go to right up to the top. And I need to do this. So good morning again. First of all, I wanted to thank Melanie for inviting me and Lauren for her teaching on the Zoom, and you can see it's a learning progress. I just wanted to alert everyone, I'm sure everyone knows that today is World Holocaust Day. And so in some ways, it's really appropriate that I'm here talking because my Jewish community is really the result of dislocation and disbursement around the world, in this case to Africa. But I'd like to start, first of all, by telling you how did we get there, because usually people are interested to know. So this is a photograph of my mother. You can all see it, I'm imagining. This is a photograph of my mother, Lily Mazur, and she's just played tennis, and she is having a little nap in the sun. Usually I would ask people to guess where it is, but it's not possible today. So I'll tell you, this is Haifa in 1936. And in the background, you can see the battleships, they're British battleships. And it's a photograph. On the back of the photograph, she's saying, I'm not supposed to be here, but I'm just taking in a little bit of sun. So my mother was actually the daughter of a Russian immigrant to England, London. And when she won a job as a shorthand secretary with the Pittman's training, in a very prestigious law firm, she tells a story about a room full of lovely young ladies, and she landed the job. And the next day she was told that she had to leave because she was Jewish. So Melanie asked me to address Jewish Uganda, anti-Semitism, and the Abadaya, and I'll do my very best to do that. And I'm starting with a little bit of anti-Semitism. So in England at that time, there was a lot of anti-Semitism because the cotton mills in the north of England were not doing well. And the story was that all the banks were owned by Jews. Where have you heard that one before? But anyway, really, in reality, only 2 bankers were Jewish. So my mother, much to the consternation of her parents, broke her engagement, took a boat, is here in Haifa, and she met my father, who was a German refugee, and they got married. And then when Rommel was coming across North Africa, they decided to leave because my father didn't want to be caught again. And my mother was a British subject, and she actually was earning more than my father. So they went to Eritrea, which is right here. So you can see Eritrea and you can see Asmara.
Janice, we're not seeing your slides right now. Do you want to click on screen share? Did you find that button?
No.
Okay.
Is it in green? Is it in green at the bottom of your screen?
Nothing at the bottom of my screen. I've just got all my icons.
Take your mouse there. No, move your mouse there. It might come up then.
In your Zoom screen.
Yes.
Screen share is at the top of mine.
If
Look up at the-
she's on an iPad, it might be on the top.
Okay, sorry.
Okay.
All right.
It says share, collaborate with others.
Share.
Click share.
Share, collaborate with others. Use Keynote Live, send a copy.
If you click share,
I will
Share.
click there. I did.
So
Oh.
Janice, for now, how about we just proceed, and then if we're able to maybe show it at the end
Yeah.
or share it at another time, but we can still go forward with it, with the presentation.
So there is a picture which is not able to be shown of a map. And in that map, there is a showing of Eritrea. And that is where my parents were, in Asmara, and I was born there. In 1949, my parents moved to Uganda. And of course you can't see, but on the map, there is the coastline, and then there is Kenya with Nairobi, and then in that is Uganda. And I do not see anything about a share anywhere at all. So in Uganda, my father was unable to find a job in Kenya because Kenya had had a Jewish community starting in 1903 with 3 Jews who were going to make a synagogue, build a synagogue in 1912. And in 1912, they had the population which was equal to that of Uganda in 1957, which was the height of the Jewish community in Kampala. Then we would move on to a picture of where my father landed up in the forest, if you like, or jungle, which is not a correct word, but 8 miles out of Kampala. And there he was the manager of a tile and brickwork factory. He had been given that job by a very kind Jewish man in Nairobi. And why was my father in Uganda? He was in Uganda because he didn't have the 50 pounds, English pounds, which he required in order for a head tax to stay in Kenya. And so he went on to Uganda. Uganda was low-lying, disease-ridden until the early last century when penicillin and so on became available. So if you could, you would not go to Uganda. And as a result, just the dribs and drabs of Jews and others arrived in Uganda. Kampala, where my father stopped, was a city, a town in 1947. Before that, it didn't have any municipal council or anything like that. I'm bypassing the history of Uganda because I was asked to speak about Jewish Uganda, anti-Semitism, and the Abadaya. So when we arrived, my mother and I, having been in England for 9 months while my father was prospecting work, we came on a tiny little aeroplane and it stopped off in 3 places, or from London, England to Entebbe, which at that time was the capital of Uganda. And that's where the airport was. And the airplane before us and the airplane after us crashed. So it's just lucky that we actually got there at all. And while we were flying over the Sahara Desert, I happened to look out of the window and we were passing a slower airplane. And there was a nun in the window with a wimple around her face. And she waved at me and I waved back, if you can imagine that. So we arrived in Kampala and my mother was shocked because in this little sort of wasn't really a house. It was an office come room and a bit of a kitchen, I guess, with a wood stove. My mother always was terribly upset because her cakes flopped or burnt. There were rats bouncing around in the sacking on the ceiling. And we were there for about 2 years, where my father made tiles and bricks out of the clay, and they were laid out on grass, elephant grass. Elephant grass is very tall. They were laid out on elephant grass. And so you could say, I suppose, that my father actually helped to build Kampala from that time. Now, the next picture, if only I could see the share, which I cannot see a share anywhere, is a very funny picture of two men. One is rather plump and the other is rather skinny and has very funny knobbly knees. And they're dressed in khaki uniform. And this khaki uniform was because all Europeans, Jews and otherwise, were expected to be able to protect the white people from the black people who might have a rebellion or might do something, because they were sort of relegated to working on plantations, because that is what the British government deemed Uganda to be, was plantation of the sugarcane, coffee, tea, and sisal. Whereas Kenya had a different way of looking at things, and you could actually buy land in Kenya. And so many of the Jews became Jewish farmers in Kenya. So all that my father was armed with was a truncheon, and this is all that he had in order to keep order. He never actually had to use it, but it's just a funny picture because they're hamming it up. So what might be some of the professions that Jewish people had in Kampala? They had, we had everybody. We had some secretaries. My mother worked for the municipal council. We had about 4 stay-at-home mothers. We had a professor of anatomy at Macquarie College, which became a university. Some of the African people at that time would go to England to do study, but many of them would actually stay at Macquarie College. That was the idea that the British thought. Then the African person would be educated and be able to self-govern. We had a school teacher who taught at an African school. And I remember going to a play where it was supposed to be a train, and they had some of the children running behind a supposed window of the train, carrying telegraph poles, excepting that sometimes they didn't get down low enough and you could see their heads bobbing by. And I remember at 6 years old thinking that that wasn't really quite a train moving. We had no synagogue, we had no rabbi, we had no infrastructure. We were just 23 families. And the Rabbi Julius Kalibach of the day in Nairobi, in his little booklet, which actually cost me $60 US when I bought it in order to do my research, has no mention at all of the Kampala Jewish community. He vaguely mentions that we only had 60 boxes of matzah, whereas Nairobi had many, many more boxes of matzah, because at that time, Nairobi had 500 people and a rabbi. So we managed, we were secular, we did have celebrations, we did do Pesach, we did do a Rosh Hashanah. In fact, many of those occurrences happened in my parents' house. The next picture, if only I could share, is a picture. Can you see that? No, you can't, can you?
No, unfortunately, we can't, Janice. Sorry.
This is just horrible. So in this picture, the background is of the law courts. And in the foreground is a gentleman with a rather rotund tummy. And he is the governor of Uganda. Now, guess what? This gentleman is Jewish. His name is Sir Andrew Cohen, and he was the Governor General from 1952 until 1957. And he's wearing a white pith helmet, I do wish you could see, with lovely white feathers sort of draped down over his helmet. And he's holding a proclamation. There's a young European boy who's reading the proclamation, and he happens to be my cousin. And I was terribly upset because I thought I should have had the job of reading that proclamation. Beside him, but slightly in the background, is a Black young woman who is learning to be a nurse. And she's dressed in a white uniform and a white cap, a nursing cap. Perhaps if any of you were nurses, you might remember that sort of peculiar headgear, all starched, of course. And next to her is an East Indian Boy Scout. So this was a very important day. It was Youth Day on May the 27th. And we all, the rest of us, had to sort of march past in goose step and salute the Governor General as we went by. It was also known as Victoria Day and later on as the Queen's Birthday Day. But this was 1956. So the Governor General, Sir Andrew Cohen, was a British man. He came from a very distinguished English family. And here he was in Uganda. He was the very first Governor General who did not use his position to better his own coffers. He was extremely interested in education for the Black person, and he was instrumental in helping Makerere College become the place that it is today. He got into a bit of a problem because the Kabaka, the king of Uganda, was a sort of a puppet king, I guess, and he was supposed to do what the British told him. He decided that he didn't like to do that, and Sir Andrew Cohen sent him to England for about 2 years. And when he came back again, the Kabaka, as actually the king of Buganda, which is a province within Uganda, he, for the very first time, was able to choose his own council, which in that era was really quite forward thinking. So some people will admire Sir Andrew Cohen and other people will not admire Sir Andrew Cohen. Now, the next picture is a very sweet little picture of two little girls. And we're dressed in very pretty dresses and we're both holding little posies. We both have little flowers in our hair. And I'm the older one, I'm 9 years old. And the other little girl is called Ruth Leviton. And the reason why it's important is that Julius Karlebach, the rabbi in Nairobi, basically said that there were no weddings in Kampala. So this photo, if only you could see it, is really quite important because it's showing that indeed there were weddings in Kampala. There were 4 weddings in actual fact, one before we arrived in 1949 and 2 while we were there. One in which we show the picture of a Jewish Polish refugee called Steve Pullman, and he married a non-Jewish woman. And then a few years later, another man came from Czechoslovakia, and he married a nurse, and he used to smoke a pipe. And then after we left in 1961, because Uganda became independent in 1962, there was one more wedding. So 4 weddings. If you think 23 Jewish families, not a bad innings. If you think about how many children were born, there were 17 Ugandan-born children, Jewish, during that time from 1949 to 1961. So you can see we did in our very own small way sort of help the British Empire and Jews in general by producing 17 children. I'm quite proud of that because Karlebach doesn't like to know very much about the Jewish community in Kampala. And I'm pretty sure that most of you who, if you're still here because you can't see the pictures, I'm pretty sure that most of you would not have known about a European Jewish community on the equator. So the next slide, if only you could see it, is actually in our sitting room. And there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and a bit of somebody, 9. So there would have most probably have been more. But the photograph shows my aunt, Anne Block, who came with her husband, Cecil Block, in about 1954. And my mother, who is looking very elegant, everybody is in evening dress with a gold brooch in her hair. Next to that comes my father, who has his usual funny smile on his face in a very nice suit. Well, not so nice, because we weren't actually really very rich at all. Next to that is Ilse Dockelman, who was actually a refugee. And perhaps you'll ask me more about that, because I wasn't asked to talk about refugees as such. And next to her are 2 East Indians. Now, if you know about the East Indian area of Cochin, and perhaps some of you have even been to Goa, there the Portuguese intermarried, and some of them were Jews. And so this East Indian lady is wearing a sari and very beautiful earrings. And then there are 3 other people, one of whom is my uncle, who had an incredibly sarcastic sense of humor. We would come back from boarding school because children couldn't stay in Uganda for high school because it was considered that the climate was too hot and that the girls especially would develop bosoms too quickly. I'm not sure what happened to the African and Indian East Indian young girls. But anyway, so at age 12, we all had to go to boarding school in Nairobi or Eldoret, the girls and the boys separate, of course. And the train ride was 1 night and 1 day to go from Kampala to Uganda. And on that same train would sometimes come a salami, 1 whole long salami. Can you imagine this salami being cut up into the pieces that certain Jewish families had requested, and my parents being very anxious that would they actually pay up for this little delicacy that had traveled all by itself on the train from Nairobi to Kampala. So a very peculiar sort of an existence, you could say. We did celebrate Pesach, as I mentioned. One time I remember having to be out in the garden waiting for the little bit of the moon to come up and then to run indoors and tell the adults that we could start the Pesach celebration. Sometimes in later years, the group would choose to be in a hotel. But at one time, they had actually hired a rabbi who came from, it might have been Nairobi or South Africa, but I think it was Nairobi. And he came to do a Rosh Hashanah event, celebration. And we had hired, or my parents and everyone had hired a kindergarten room in the primary school. And they had set it up according to what they imagined it should look like. And my mother in a letter says that it really was rather expensive. It was a bit of a flop because nobody really knew what to do or how to proceed in the readings and whatever one would do in a service. There was another experience where Mr. Hertzberg, he was well known in South Africa, was in Kampala. And what was he doing there? He was fundraising. Can you imagine? From 23 families, he was fundraising for United Jewish Appeal. And everybody had their pishka box, and some people gave a little bit more. And that was an event, again, in my parents' home, actually on a huge veranda that we had. And she says that it was a very beautiful event with candles and white tablecloths and silver. And my aunt had lent her houseboy for the event. And it was all a huge success, she said. So we did celebrate things. And then the next slide, if you could only see it, is a picture of the cover of my book. Not that I'm pushing that, but for the picture that's on the front of it, because that is the whole of the Jewish community. We fit into one large room. When I went to England in 2005 to do some of my research, to interview 4 people, 2 of whom actually lived in England, 1 in Australia and 1 elsewhere, we were able in England that particular day, together with Ilse Dockelman, who I've mentioned, and her 2 children, because she had invited me to lunch, and she actually gave me this photograph. And between the 4 of us, 4 of us, we were able to name every single person in the photograph. So this particular photo, I believe, is only one of, and it's very important, as I think, because it shows that there was indeed a Jewish community. So we want to talk a little bit about anti-Semitism, and I mentioned the fact that I had to go away to boarding school. When I was 12 years old, we followed the British way of education. So at 11, actually, we had to do the exam in order to stream us whether we were going to be able to go to university and whether we were going to be in the carpenter's shop, which I actually think is really unfair, because how many of you knew what you wanted to do when you were 11 or 12 years old? Anyway, it so happened that I was quite a bright child, and my parents would have preferred me to go to a private school. And that private school was called Limuru High School, and it was closer to Nairobi than Kampala. It was closer to Nairobi than the school I actually went to in Eldoret, called the Highlands School. Now, if you can imagine, it was a long, arduous trip on a Murram road. Murram is a red earth that when it's wet, it becomes extremely muddy. We had to get to the edge of the Rift Valley, which, as you know, starts in Israel. And we had to wind our way down that along the bottom, where we most probably stopped in Nakuru because there was a Jewish community center there, up the other side to Limuru, a very small place where my parents had an interview with the principal of that particular school. The end result was that I was told by my parents that I wouldn't be going to Limuru because it was too expensive, and I would be going to the public school in Eldoret. Now that meant that my parents had to pay 60 English pounds per term in order to keep me at school. And some of the girls, especially the Dutch Afrikaans girls whose parents were farmers, had to leave school before the time to take another exam in order to get into university. And as a result, they have, because I'm still in contact with several of them, if you can imagine, and here in Vancouver, there are 8 of us who went to that school, 2 of whom actually went to primary school with me, right here in Kampala, or where am I? In Vancouver, I mean. So later on, when I was doing my research, and I had a book about the Jews in Nairobi, I discovered that indeed there was anti-Semitism, and that because I was a Jewish child, that was the reason why I had not been allowed to attend this private school. And perhaps in the States, but here in Vancouver, last century, Jews were not allowed into clubs. And the Jewish community here actually built their own golf club. And there was and still is an elite area across the water from me on the North Shore. And that was supposedly banned for Jews as well. And I was a physiotherapist once upon a time, and one of my patients happened to tell me that her best friend was Jewish, and because she could not bring her into the sailing club in Vancouver, she dropped her membership there, which I thought was very honorable. So anti-Semitism in Kampala was not overt, but it was hidden. It had a very dark belly. As a result, as an example, my father, who was a German Jew, who who changed his passport to Palestinian, and there he was in Uganda, was considered an alien. And as a result, his work he was paid less for his work than somebody else who might have gone to an English school. My father spoke with an excellent English accent, although in later years he reverted back to his German accented English. But in that time, you wouldn't have known that he was from Germany, from Berlin, actually, Breslau. So there was another man, Mr. Franco, who also had a problem getting a promotion in his work as an engineer. And he had a word with Sir Andrew Cohen, the Jewish governor, who then pulled some strings, I guess. And Danny Franco's father managed to have a promotion. So it was there. There was also a place called the Top Club where the colonials would go for drinks and to meet people and perhaps to actually do some business. And it wasn't until later years that we joined. The official reason was that we actually had a little bit more money, and that's why we could join. But I hazard a guess that indeed it was because of muted anti-Semitism. There was a pantomime there once, and the fairy queen came out. Do you do that in the States? She came out with her sparkly dress and a wand and a beautiful star on her head. It was a Christmas pantomime, and English pantomimes can become quite raucous. And the fairy godmother said, "It is love," she said, brandishing her wand, "that makes the world go round." And my mother said, "No, it's onions that make the world go round." And I remember just cowering in my seat. How could my mother possibly be so rude? Anyway, so that is an overall of anti-Semitism. It definitely was there. When I went to boarding school, I did have a couple of events of anti-Semitism, one of which was not very pleasant. And I actually marched up to the head table in the dining room and complained about this girl. And she then stopped bugging me. It happened because on a Saturday, my parents had allowed me to do horse riding, and we were late back for supper. And it happened that I had been a very good rider, but going through a loquat orchard, that's an orchard where there are tiny little orange fruit. And the idea was that as you were going by, you had to sort of catch as many loquats as you could at a canter. And I fell off my horse. And thank goodness I still had the reins in my hand. And the riding teacher, who in a book, another book, not mine, when the crocodile eats the sun, was the name of the book. She talks about this riding teacher and what a vile temper she had. So she yelled at me and she said, "Get off your ass and get back on your bloody horse." Can you imagine talking to anybody like that these days? Anyway, I got back on my horse, but I fell from favor, and the anti-Semitism or bullying came to the fore. So I learned to box and I learned to fight for myself very early in life. Okay, I hope we haven't lost everybody. The next picture is of a man called Victor Franco. He's sitting on a sofa, which is sort of wicker with wood around it. And he has a table beside him, and he's reading a book. And he's wearing shorts, which most colonials wore. Shorts and long stockings, below the knee, long stockings. But Victor actually has short socks on. And he's just got an open neck shirt with a cross, a square design on it. He has a mustache and he looks quite dashing. He's got a lot of hair. Now, Victor Franco was born in Egypt, in Cairo, and he was very colorful. Why am I telling you this? I'm telling you this because he has a connection with the Abadiah, who I also was requested to talk about. Victor Franco married Teresa Franco, who as a child had walked out of Poland. And I always imagined that it was by herself. In actual fact, she had joined a group of people who came to Kampala, to Uganda, and were put into a refugee camp under the British. They were mainly Polish. Within that grouping were about 12 Jews. And there was a rabbi who came up from South Africa to visit on one or two occasions. And depending on the research, there were approximately 12 or maybe slightly more Jews within about 1,500 Poles and others. They were there not for their own benefit, because they had walked from Europe through Iran, Iraq, some of you might know that, through India, and then here they were in Uganda. And so Teresa Franco was in Koja camp on the shores of Lake Victoria. And as a young person, I became a Girl Guide. Can you imagine? The name of my group was the Tulip Group. Why not use an African flower or something like that? Anyway, and when I went to camp, guess what? I found these toilets that I was supposed to clean as my daily job. Do you think that could have been anti-Semitism, or was that just my job? But anyway, and I couldn't understand why there were these toilets in the middle of the bush, or the bundu, as we used to call it. And so Teresa Franco, when I was interviewing her in England, told me that that was the Koja camp. So she married Victor Franco, who's sitting on this chair reading a rather fat book. And the story goes, and I do believe this is true, that he, Victor Franco, together with Phil Leviton, who was the father of the other little girl in the bridesmaids picture, Ruth Leviton, and they together, from about 1940 up until the time that they left, would go to the Abadaya and give them money, give them, maybe some books, and to talk to them about Judaism. Phil Leviton's father, Moshe, at the very beginning of last century, in the 1920s, actually met Kakangulu, who was at that time the leader of his tribe. And in the century before that, in the 1880s and 1890s, he had been helpful to the British by rallying Africans with spears to help the British obtain Uganda. Uganda was very important. I'm saying it in the colonial way. Melanie said it in the correct manner, because Uganda was required as part of the British Commonwealth. It was, well, empire, I should say, at that time, and it was important because of the scramble for Africa at that time. So Moshe was walking, he was a merchant at that time, and he would walk around in Uganda, as did another man called Automarcus, who became very rich and had huge, big company which did trading and ivory and other things. So Victor Franco and Phil Leviton, whose father, Moshe Leviton, were very instrumental in helping the Abadaya at that time, because the Black people were on the lower rung, you could say, and to have Black Jews was just not to be thought about at all. Ironically, today, as some of you know, the Abadaya are doing very well. And you know that in 1917, they had 5 weddings and about 1,500 visitors. And my Jewish community doesn't actually even have a cemetery. My uncle Maury was buried in that cemetery. Hazel Bernstein, who now lives in South Africa, her grandmother was buried in that cemetery. But there is no cemetery. The Abadaya have a cemetery. They have a synagogue, which was built in 1998 in Kampala. And those are the people who you know about, I'm sure, and perhaps have even met their rabbi, their traveling rabbi, and perhaps have even donated money to their cause. And maybe you heard yesterday or the day before that it has now been decided that indeed the Abadiah, and that means also the Lemba and the Beta Israel groupings of Jews, are not allowed to have right of return to Israel. Now, my very last slide, if only you could see it, is quite important because it is the opening of the Bulangi. The Bulangi is the government of Uganda. And this was in 1959, actually. And on the step, you can see my grandmother who's visiting from Germany. If you can believe, she was brought to England with her husband by my mother's family to escape all the horrors of the Holocaust. And after the war, in the 1950s, 60s, Germany was very kind and did very well for my grandmother. So she actually went to a nursing home in Germany and died in Germany. But here she is visiting us in Kampala, and we're standing on the steps of the Bulangi, and all around us are Black people. So the only Europeans or white people are the three of us. And so that was really the beginning of independence. And as you know, independence happened in 1992. In 1987, there was a letter that was sent from the Jewish Commonwealth Council office to a woman in Sweden saying, to the best of their knowledge, there was no European Jewish community in Kampala. In 1971, a woman by the name of Susan Gittleson, who happened to be American, came to Uganda, and she said that you could sort of manage to have a sort of religious life, but really it was very secular. So that, in a nutshell, is the story. And I am full of apologies for this awful thing about the overheads. And if you're still there, thank you so much. Questions if you'd like.
Thank you so much, Thank you so much, Janice. Shortly, we'll be taking questions, so please type them into the chat, which can be found at the bottom toolbar at the bottom of your Zoom screen where it says chat, or you can raise your hand if you're not familiar with the chat and we'll call on you. Before we get to the questions, we have a few short announcements. The JCC Senior Department invites you to a Middle East update with Dan Schwimmer on February 15th at 2 p.m. And I'll put the registration link in the chat. You can also check out our website, lfjcc.org. And we'll also be sending out an email blast with some senior upcoming events. And now I'd like to turn it over to Lauren to make some JLearn announcements. Oh, I'm so glad we found the video.
Oh, fantastic.
So
All right.
I'm just going through very quickly just to show you.
That's great. No, please keep it up. You can go through those while I'm speaking. Thanks, Janice, and thanks, Melanie. As far as, and again, while we're waiting for people to put some chats into the bar below or to raise your hand and kind of think about what questions you would like to ask to Janice, I would like to just tell you about one of our upcoming JLearn programs, which again is the Adult Jewish Education Department at the JCC. We have the next lecture in our 2020-2021 Mandelbaum Family Lecture Series with Rebecca Moore, who will be speaking on a different look at Jewish and Christian relations. And that will be Wednesday, February 10th, so 2 weeks from today at 10:30 a.m. Pacific time. You can register for that either at lfjcc.org/learning, or we will put a registration link in the chat. We also have the 31st annual San Diego International Jewish Film Festival taking place on February 11th through the 21st. And this year's film festival is entirely virtual with 36 screenings you can view right from the comfort of your home. And then to get more information or buy your tickets, we will provide the link in the chat as well. And then also we'll provide a link for Janice's book, Shalom Uganda, A Jewish Community on the Equator, which is available on Amazon. And again, we will be putting that into the chat. And so, and already Melanie has put a few of those links into the chat. Thank you so much, Melanie. And again, if you do have any questions, please feel free to start writing them into the chat for us now, and I will give them to Janice. Additionally, you can, down at the bottom of your Zoom video, there is a bar. There's one that says reactions, and there you can press the raise hand button, and then we would be able to unmute you. Okay. We'll give a minute or so for people to add their questions if you do have any. And Janice, was there anything else you wanted to add now that we're able to see all these beautiful, stunning pictures?
This one here, this picture here of the tile and brickwork factory, here would have been our little house, and down here is the factory. As such, you can see that it's really in the middle of nowhere. The burial places for all of the Kabakas were at mile 5. We were at mile 8. And again, history, did I ever know that I lived so close to these burial places, which are visited by many people today? Well, not during COVID, of course. No. So the Black history was really pushed down.
Thank you. So we do have a question from Faye that asked, what caused your parents to move to Uganda in the first place? They may have just missed at the beginning of the presentation.
That's an interesting question, isn't it? My parents were in Haifa. They very badly wanted to have a child, and they felt that they weren't able to have a child because at that time before the war, and actually they left Eritrea in 1942, they felt that it would be much better to move somewhere else that was perhaps a little safer. My mother could get a job with the British government, and my father, whose education had been interrupted on account of the Holocaust, had a job repairing airplanes. So that was in Eritrea, in actual fact. And in Eritrea, as some of you might know, there was the British Army, and there was also an American contingent. Within that American contingent, there were actually 2, maybe 3, but my parents had a special liking for one specific American serviceman who would feed me chocolate, and whose mother was just so grateful for the hospitality in this sort of out-of-the-world place in Asmara at 4,000 plus feet above sea level, that she would send American clothes for me, because otherwise my clothes would have been made out of parachute material or made by my mother somehow from something else. So that's how come my parents were in Eritrea. In Eritrea itself, in Asmara, there was a Sephardic community at that time of about 500 people. Today, there is only Sami Cohen, who looks after that cemetery, which is beautifully set up, unlike Kampala that doesn't really have one, with little photographs above the headstones, bougainvillea, and so on in the cemetery. The synagogue is an absolute sweetheart. It's very small. It has a wall around it with a sort of a lovely metal gate. And then the synagogue itself is very small. The women's gallery is tiny. Each chandelier is different, and the women made the Torah covers and the cushion covers for the seats, and it's all still there. There is an Israeli, or was, I visited in 2005. That's how I know all of this, apart from reading. There is an Israeli embassy there, and they had Yom Ha'atzmaut when we were there. So can you imagine Israeli security on the outside? You walk inside, there's a huge big screen with everything you can imagine about Israel, and the food is absolutely Eritrean. And most of the people who arrived were dressed in Eritrean clothing. It was not possible. We were there for 2 Shabbats, and it was not possible to open a Torah because the Israeli embassy made up 4 or 5 people, including security, us, another couple who were visiting, and Sami Cohn, who was so kind to us and so hospitable. We were 9, not 10. So that synagogue is being cared for. And my mother, when she was living in Eritrea, tells a story about Jews who were in prison in Eritrea. There was also another place in Gilgil in Kenya. I can talk about that more if you like, but we're talking about Eritrea right now. And those Jews were Israelis, well, not Israelis at that time, but trying to get independence for Israel. And so the British didn't like what they were doing, blowing up things, etc., as you well know. And so they were shipped off to Asmara, well out of the way. So they built tunnels from their prison to the library. And my mother would sort of nod at them as she walked by, and they would nod back. The tunnels were big enough to have signs saying, mind your head. They had electricity. And when I was reading one of my mother's letters, my next project, put all of her letters together from 1932 until 1992, she talks about an escape. And before the escape, the Jews had sort of come into town wearing a police uniform, wearing a major's uniform, going to the cinema. So you can see it really was just get the Jews out of the way, away from Israel or Palestine of the day, but don't worry about much more. And so while we were there in Asmara, there was actually a filming company looking to make a film about these passages and to unblock these tunnels that had been blocked. So that was a long answer. I hope that was interesting.
No, thank you so much for sharing. So we have just a couple more questions. These will be our last questions for today. So one was from someone who had messaged Melanie and mentioned that your mother, you were talking about your mother who broke her engagement in England and then went to possibly Palestine. And they were asking if you can talk about your mother's adventurous spirit a little bit more.
Thank you. I'm happy to do that. My mother, I thought, was extremely brave. One, to go by herself on a steamship and leave her family. They wanted letters and photographs every single week. And so that's why there are so many letters. I think that she was extremely brave because she was British. She worked for the British Petroleum Company. And so she was sort of above criticism, I suppose you could say, or an eye being cast. So she was safe. She had a little apartment that her father had given her money for, with folding table and folding bed. It was just like a one room really. And apparently people would sort of come through at night, sleep on the floor. She also had guns that she would carry from A to B or store. And I often think to myself, my goodness, if she had been caught, I doubt that I would have been here, at least not in the shape that I am now. So I think that she was extremely, extremely brave to have done that.
Thank you so much for sharing. And then our final question for today was from Faye. So where were your ancestors from and how did they end up in Eritrea/Africa in the first place? And they say, thank you for sharing your interesting history.
Thank you for thinking that without the photos. Well, my father, my grandfather on my mother's side, like so many of us, was Russian. And like so many of us left Russia during the pogroms, I think in 1906. That seems to be about the correct date, but I can't swear to it. And he arrived in England as a 16-year-old. He ended up having a grocery store on Charlton Street. Charlton Street joins up with Euston Road for anyone who is familiar with London at all. I really don't know London, but when I was there in 1949, the grocery store that my grandfather had the house next to it, because it's row housing, was bombed. And the top of the road was also bombed. And I can clearly remember a blue door hanging. And children, I would be allowed out into the street and I would be playing in these bombed sites. That corner now of Euston Road and Charlton is actually the British Library. That's the point there. So my grandmother, I think, was also Russian, but I'm not sure if she came separately or if she was one generation back, being in England. I don't know. I just know that she died of abdominal cancer during the war, and my mother flew from Eritrea to be at her side. My father's family were German, and came from Berlin and Breslau area. And my grandfather won the Iron Cross in the First World War for healing cavalry horses so that they could be sent back to the front. That didn't help in the Second World War. He was tried, one of those sort of odd, funny trials, which wasn't really a trial. And my father, who had already walked out of Germany and was actually in Lithuania, came back again into Germany for that particular trial. And my grandfather then went to Auschwitz, and then he did the march to Mauthausen, and he died 3 days before the end of the war, or liberation, I should say. Not 3 days, 3 weeks before the end of the war. So, and I'm an only child, and I don't know if anyone else are only children on account of things that happened during the war.
Thank you again, Janice, so much. So we are going to wrap up now. If there are other questions, I think that we can possibly send those to Janice and then she can respond to them after the presentation. But Janice, I know that you also wanted to mention about the memorial for the Kampala Jewish community. Did you want to take a moment to mention that as we end things today?
Yeah, thank you. Something really exciting happened last week. There was a talk here at our synagogue by a rabbi called Rabbi Silberhaft, who is the traveling rabbi in Africa, because there are many little Jewish communities in South Africa that are really not able to support. Windhoek in Namibia is one of them. And anyway, he was showing a picture of a memorial. It was a huge big rock with a plaque on it. And I thought, oh, I've been wanting to have a memorial for so long. So I had been in contact with him through my research, and we are going to create a memorial in Kampala for the European Jewish community that was there then. That's all. And I'm so excited. Thank you.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I want to say, Janice, thank you so much on behalf of myself, on behalf of Melanie, and all of our participants and everybody for sharing your incredible story. It has been such a treat, and we are so grateful that you joined us today.